The mist that hangs low over the fjord in the grey dawn light is not merely a feature of the landscape, it is a veil, a boundary between the world of men and the world of unseen forces. In the mind of the Viking Age Scandinavian, every forest clearing, every windswept headland, every still dark pool of water held a potential gateway. The universe was alive, thrumming with spirits, gods, and fate, a vast, intricate web where the threads of destiny were spun by the Norns and could, on rare and terrifying occasions, be glimpsed or even tugged by those with the sight. This was the domain not of the warrior king whose power was written in steel and blood, but of a far more elusive and feared figure, the völva, the seers. To understand her is to step into a shadow history of the Viking world, a parallel narrative where battles were won or lost not on the strength of arms alone, but on the whispered words of an old woman sitting on a high seat, her eyes closed, her mind journeying to places where ordinary men would go mad. Her authority was ancient, predating the rule of law and the structure of earls and kings, rooted in a primal understanding that knowledge of what is to come is the ultimate form of power, and that those who traffic with the fabric of fate itself are both indispensable and profoundly dangerous. The term völva translates simply to staff bearer, a deceptively mundane name for a role of immense supernatural and social weight. Her staff was no walking stick, it was her sigil of office, often made of iron and metal revered for its power to ward off malicious spirits and intricately decorated. It was a key, a conductor, a weapon of the spirit. She was a wanderer, moving from farmstead to great hall, a figure operating outside the conventional structures of a society otherwise rigidly defined by gender, family, and class. She was often elderly, having lived beyond the typical lifespans of the age, which in itself lent her an aura of accumulated wisdom and survival. She traveled with an entourage, sometimes of younger apprentices or family members, and her arrival was met with a mixture of dread and meticulous hospitality. To offend a völva was to risk not just her curse, but to alienate the very forces she commanded. The preparations for her ritual, the seiðr, were elaborate and demanded significant investment from her hosts. A special feast was prepared, with foods of a particular nature, and a high seat was constructed for her, stacked with cushions so she would be elevated above all others in the hall. This physical elevation mirrored her spiritual one, setting her apart in a space that was neither fully of this world nor the next. The ritual of seiðr itself is shrouded in the descriptions of the sagas, depicted as a strange and taxing ceremony. The völva would enter a trance state, her consciousness traveling beyond the confines of her body to gain hidden knowledge. The purpose was typically divination, to foresee the outcome of a harvest, to locate lost items, to reveal the intentions of enemies, or to foretell the destiny of a newborn child. But the sources hint at a darker, more active potential. Seiðr could be used for manipulation, to bind men's minds, to summon storms against enemy ships, or to wither the strength of a foe. It was a magic intrinsically linked to fate, and to meddle with it was considered a perilous act that could unravel the weaver's own spirit. Notably, this form of sorcery carried a deep social stigma for men. The god Odin himself, the All-Father, was a master of seiðr, but his pursuit of this knowledge was recounted in the myths as a transgressive, shameful act that other gods mocked him for. In a hyper-masculine warrior culture, the passive, trance-like state of seiðr was associated with ergi, a complex term encompassing unmanliness, sexual passivity, and perversion. For a man to practice, it was to risk losing all honor and social standing. This gendered aspect of the magic cemented the völva's unique position. Her power existed in a category separate from and parallel to the masculine power of the chieftain, making her influence both untouchable and inherently suspect. To see the völva through the lens of the literary record is to peer through a smoky glass where history, folklore, and Christian revisionism blur together. Yet, some figures step from the pages with such vivid force that they demand to be seen as echoes of a profound reality. The most iconic portrait comes from the saga of Eric the Red, which describes the visit of a völva named Thorbjorg to a struggling Greenland settlement. The saga paints a meticulous, almost anthropological picture of her arrival and ritual. Thorbjorg is depicted wearing a blue or black cloak adorned with stones, a necklace of glass beads, a black lambskin hood lined with white cat's fur, and catskin gloves. Each item is symbolic, believed to hold power the cat, sacred to the goddess Freya, the mistress of seiðr, the staff tipped with brass and set with stones. She is waited upon by a choir of women who sing the varðlokka, or warding songs, incantations meant to summon the spirits so she could read their messages. The entire community participates, providing the feast and heeding her prophecies, which include both practical advice for survival and a glimpse of a future where the old gods fade and a new, white-clad god takes their place, a clear Christian interpolation by the saga author, yet one that speaks to the perceived twilight of the völvas world. Here, her role is one of communal salvation. She is the key to averting famine, a technician of the sacred operating for the good of all. But other sagas show a darker, more political facet. The Vatnsdæla saga tells of another Thorbjörg, known as the Little Völva, who is explicitly hired by a powerful matriarch, Ingemund, to locate a sacred talisman and ensure the prosperity of her family line. This is magic in service of dynastic ambition. In the Laxdæla saga, the Seeres Kotkel and his family use seiðr to destroy a rival through a curse that manifests as a haunting and a deadly landslide, illustrating how these powers could be weaponized in blood feuds. Perhaps the most chilling example of direct political manipulation comes from the saga of Harald Fairhair, the king credited with first unifying Norway. The saga recounts how a Finnish sorceress, Finns being particularly feared for their magical prowess in Norse lore, was employed by Harald's enemies. She performed a rite to raise a storm to drown the king as he sailed along the coast. The ritual involved complex sympathetic magic, and it nearly succeeded, demonstrating that kings, for all their temporal might, were seen as vulnerable to this form of ethereal assassination. The völva's power could thus be a tool of the state or a weapon against it, a wild card in the brutal game of Viking Age politics. Beyond the sagas, archaeology provides tantalizing, silent testimony that corroborates the central place of these figures. Across Scandinavia, graves of women from the Viking Age have been found containing the very staffs described in the literature. These are not mere rods of wood, but often elaborate artifacts of iron and precious metals. One notable grave from the Danish island of fiercest held an elderly woman buried in a wagon, a sign of high status, alongside a bronze box, fine clothing, and a staff of iron. Notably, she also possessed a peculiar collection of items: henbane seeds, a plant known for its potent, psychoactive and toxic properties, and the wing bone of a raven, Odin's bird. The assemblage paints a picture far removed from that of a wife or mother. It is the toolkit of a ritual specialist. Another grave at Clinta on Öland revealed a woman buried with 2 staffs, crystal beads, and a rare glass bowl, likely acquired through extensive trade networks, suggesting her services were valued enough to grant her access to exotic wealth. These women were not marginal witches living in the woods. They were individuals of substantial means and social standing, interred with honors that speak to a recognized and institutionalized role within their communities. Their graves are the physical anchors for the literary descriptions, proving that the völva was not a figment of mythic imagination, but a tangible, powerful presence in the Viking world. The source of the völva's power was a tapestry woven from many threads: deep ancestral tradition, a mastery of esoteric knowledge, and, suggestively, the possible use of psychoactive substances to breach the boundaries of consciousness. The ritual foods prepared for her, as hinted at in the sagas, were not ordinary meals. Descriptions sometimes mention dishes made with animal hearts or blood, organs considered seats of life force and vitality. More compelling is the archaeological evidence, like the furcat grave's henbane seeds. Henbane, a plant in the nightshade family, contains powerful tropane alkaloids like scopolamine and hyoscyamine. When ingested or smoked in carefully controlled doses, it can induce vivid hallucinations, delirium, and a profound dissociation from the body, a state easily interpreted as soul, travel, or communion with spirits. Its effects are notoriously unpredictable and dangerous, a line between vision and poison that a skilled practitioner would have learned to walk. Other plants native to the Nordic landscape, such as fly, agaric mushrooms, or certain species of hemlock, may also have been part of this pharmacopoeia of the unseen. The völva's trance, therefore, might not have been purely a feat of mental discipline, but a chemically aided journey, a deliberate intoxication undertaken in a sacred context to achieve a specific prophetic end. This pharmacological key adds a layer of grim practicality to the rituals. Her visions were bought at a physical cost, her body a vessel for poisons that unlocked doors to other realms. Her knowledge extended beyond botany into astronomy, meteorology, and a deep observational understanding of human and animal psychology. To interpret the visions brought on by trance, or to make pronouncements without it, required a formidable intellect. She would have been a living repository of folklore, genealogy, and history, the news of her time, gleaned from her travels. A change in migratory bird patterns, rumors of strife in a distant valley, the health of local livestock, the strange birth of a deformed calf, all were data points in her prophetic calculus. When a chieftain asked about the outcome of a raid, she was not merely channeling a spirit, she was synthesizing this vast array of information, assessing the strength of the parties involved, the season, the political climate, and delivering a judgment that, thanks to her perceived connection to the divine, carried the weight of fate itself. Her prophecies were often self-fulfilling because her word alone could alter decisions. If she declared a venture doomed, men might withdraw their support, ensuring its failure. Her power was thus a feedback loop of perception and reality, where her spiritual authority and her worldly acumen were inseparable and mutually reinforcing. This placed the völva in a uniquely precarious social position. She was simultaneously revered, feared, and resented. She operated outside the normal hierarchies, yet her words could topple those within them. A king or jarl needed her blessing to legitimize his rule or his military campaigns, yet her very existence was a reminder that his power had limits, that there was an older, more nebulous authority that could override his own. This tension is palpable in the sagas, where seeresses are often shown being treated with extreme deference, but also meeting violent ends once their usefulness expired or their predictions turned unwelcome. They were the ultimate consultants, hired for their expertise, but disposable once their insights became inconvenient or threatening to the established order. Their safety hinged on their perceived utility and the unshakable belief in their capacity to curse from beyond the grave. To harm a völva was to risk a supernatural retaliation that could haunt a family for generations, a belief that acted as a powerful deterrent against those who might wish her silenced. The world of the völva, however, was not a static one. It existed in a specific historical moment, perched on the cusp of a cataclysmic cultural shift. The Viking Age was a period of intense contact, conversion, and consolidation. As seafaring networks expanded, bringing Norse traders and settlers into sustained contact with Christian Europe, the Middle East, and the Slavic world, old beliefs began to transform under new pressures. The völva represented the old, decentralized pagan worldview, a system of belief intimately tied to the land, the family, and the capricious will of many gods. The incoming Christian worldview, in stark contrast, was hierarchical, dogmatic, and monopolistic in its spiritual authority. In this new order, there was no room for a freelance female mystic who spoke directly with spirits. What the Christian church called prophecy was the domain of saints and scripture. What the völva practiced was, by their definition, witchcraft, a diabolical art to be stamped out. The process of Christianization did not instantly erase the völva. It first demonized and criminalized her. Where once her staff was a symbol of office, it became a sign of heresy. Her familiar spirits were recast as demons in league with the devil. The meticulous rituals of seiðr, once a community-sponsored service, were driven underground, transformed into malevolent witchcraft practiced in secret. The Norse law codes, as they were written down in the Christian era, bear stark witness to this persecution. The medieval Norwegian law code, known as the Gulathing law, contains a clear and chilling directive. If a man falls from a cliff or a tree and dies, that is an averki, an accident. But if he dies from witchcraft, then the witch shall be outlawed and driven from the land, and the kinsman of the deceased shall take all her property. The later Frostathing law is even more explicit, stating that any woman who travels from house to house with a staff and is thereby proven to be a völva shall be prosecuted and her goods confiscated. This legal transformation is profound. The wandering staff-bearer, once a welcome and honored guest whose arrival prompted a feast, is now a criminal whose very tools are evidence of her guilt, her practice punishable by exile and economic ruin. Her knowledge, once a public good, is now a private sin. The sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries by Christian scribes, reflect this transitional and conflicted attitude. They are nostalgic for the pagan past, yet filtered through a Christian moral lens. The völva in these stories often occupies an ambiguous space. She might be depicted with a degree of awe and historical respect, as with Thorbjörg in Greenland, yet her prophecies frequently contain Christian moralizing, predicting the fall of the old gods and the rise of the new faith. In other tales, like that of the witch-like Kotkel family in Laxdala saga, they are unequivocally the villains malicious, destructive, and ultimately doomed, their death serving as a moral lesson about the evils of pagan magic. These literary portrayals served a dual purpose. They preserved a memory of a potent cultural figure while simultaneously justifying her eradication. They transformed the völva from a contemporary authority into a figure of folklore, a relic of a dark age that the enlightened present had overcome. Yet, eradication was never complete. The deep-seated human needs she addressed, the thirst for knowledge of the future, for control over uncertainty, for healing, for cursing one's enemies, did not vanish with the baptism of a king. The practices and the belief in the völva's arts bled into the margins of the New World. Her image fragmented and persisted in various forms. She survived in folk belief as the trollakone or troll woman, a wise woman living on the edge of the village who knew herbs for healing and midwifery, but who could also cast the evil eye. Her divinatory techniques morphed into folk magic, using everyday objects for fortune-telling. Most tellingly, the horrific witch trials that swept through Europe in the early modern period found fertile ground in Scandinavia, particularly in remote regions like Iceland and Norway. The accusations leveled against these witches bear a stark resemblance to the descriptions of the völva. They were often women. They were accused of causing storms to sink ships, of cursing livestock to sicken, of using familiars, echoes of the helping spirits, and of attending nocturnal sabbaths that mirror the descriptions of spirit journeys. The persecution of the völva under Christian law can be seen as the first chapter in a long, tragic history of European witch hunts, where an independent female spiritual authority became the ultimate heresy. To examine the legacy of the völva is to trace the contours of a lost world, but also to recognize an enduring archetype. She represents a form of power that was non-martial, non-institutional, and fundamentally feminine, rooted in wisdom, trance, and a perceived conduit to the supernatural. Her decline mirrors the centralization of power, the masculinization of religious authority, and the triumph of a doctrinal, text-based faith over an experiential, oral one. Yet, the fear and fascination she inspired never truly died. She is resurrected in modern neo-pagan movements, which often look to the völva as a symbol of feminine, spiritual autonomy and a connection to pre-Christian Nordic traditions. In popular culture, from fantasy novels to television series, the Norse Seeresses is a recurring trope, a mysterious crone who delivers cryptic prophecies that drive the plot. These modern interpretations, while often romanticized, speak to the enduring potency of her image, the woman who sees what others cannot, who speaks with the voice of fate, and who, by her very existence, challenges the limits of established power. The final chapter of the historical völva is written not in sagas, but in silence and stone. It is found in the gradual cessation of staffs being placed in graves. It is heard in the fading echo of the Fartlokor songs, replaced by the Latin chant of the Mass. It is seen in the landscape itself, as high seat mounds where rituals were performed were forgotten or crowned with Christian crosses. Yet, in that silence, her presence lingers. When a storm suddenly rises on a calm sea, an older, deeper part of the mind might still whisper of magic worked from a lonely headland. When a leader makes a fateful decision based on a strange dream or an unshakable hunch, the ghost of a prophecy might stir. The völva's true power lay in her embodiment of the fundamental human confrontation with the unknown. In an age of axes and sails, she navigated the more terrifying seas of chance, time, and destiny. Her story is not merely a curious footnote about Viking witches, it is a testament to a time when the metaphysical was a palpable political force, and the most feared person in the room might very well have been an old woman with a staff, her eyes closed, seeing the bloody tapestry of the future unfold while kings and warriors waited, terrified, for her to speak. The profound psychological impact of the völva on the Viking mind cannot be overstated. In a universe governed by word or fate, a concept not of rigid predestination, but of a constantly weaving tapestry, where past actions inexorably influence the present and future, her role was that of a reader of the pattern. For a people who lived with a palpable sense of cosmic fragility, where the world itself was destined to end in the cataclysm of Ragnarok, Knowledge of one's personal thread was a consuming, existential concern. The vulva offered a terrifying gift, a glimpse of one's ordained path, which could be a vision of glory or a sentence of doom. To seek her out required immense courage, for once spoken, a prophecy could not be unheard. It would hang over an individual or a family, a psychic weight that shaped decisions and colored every subsequent event. A chieftain told his lineage would die out might become recklessly brave or despairingly passive. A mother told her child would achieve greatness might nurture a destructive arrogance. The völva's words did not just predict fate, they actively sculpted the psychological landscape in which her clients lived, becoming self-fulfilling engines of destiny through the sheer power of belief. Her pronouncements were the software running on the hardware of Norse culture, an invisible architecture of expectation and anxiety. This dynamic placed the Seeresses at the heart of some of the most pivotal moments in the Norse worldview, even at its mythic foundation. The source of our deepest understanding of Norse cosmology itself comes from a prophetic poem, the Völuspá, the prophecy of the Seeresses, spoken by a völva who is summoned by Odin to recount the history of the world from its creation to its fiery end. This framing is profoundly significant. The primary narrative of the gods, the origin of the cosmos, the very structure of the 9 worlds, is not delivered by a god in his majesty, but by an unnamed, ancient seeress, a being of such primordial power that she remembers a time before time. She recounts the coming of the gods, the war with the giants, the death of Balder, and the twilight of the gods with a detached, inevitability-laden tone. Here, the völva is not a peripheral figure, but the ultimate authority, the keeper of the cosmic story. Even Odin, the seeker of wisdom, must humble himself before her knowledge. This mythic archetype directly mirrored and legitimized the social role of the historical völva. If the Allfather himself deferred to a seeress for ultimate knowledge, how could any mortal king do otherwise?
The Vlasp cemented in the cultural consciousness the idea that the highest truth was accessible only through this feminine, ecstatic, and terrifying conduit. Being the grand myth and political manipulation, the völva's influence permeated the intimate, daily fabric of life. Her purview extended to the most fundamental human concerns: fertility, health, and the integrity of the homestead. Before a marriage alliance was finalized, her insight might be sought to ensure a fruitful union and avoid hidden familial curses. When illness struck, especially mysterious ailments that resisted herbal remedies, it was often interpreted as malicious magic or spirit affliction, requiring her intervention to diagnose and break the curse. The protection of the farmer's land, livestock, and stored food from supernatural threats was also her domain. She might be called upon to perform land-taking rituals, to sanctify boundary markers with protective spells, or to weave charms that would cause a thief's tools to break or his mind to cloud. In this capacity, she was a spiritual guardian, a necessary specialist for maintaining the cosmic order. On a micro scale, her annual or seasonal circuit of the district functioned almost as a form of metaphysical maintenance, resetting the spiritual equilibrium of each farm, renewing protective wards, and carrying news both mundane and otherworldly from one isolated community to the next. She was a living network, a node of information and ritual power that connected the scattered dots of settlement in a vast, often unforgiving landscape. The material culture surrounding the völva further illustrates her syncretic and sophisticated role. The staffs found in graves are frequently of exceptional craftsmanship, sometimes imported or made from materials with known symbolic resonance. Crystal balls or beads of rock crystal, a mineral believed to hold and focus magical power, are not uncommon finds, and there, with its electrostatic properties and cellular associations, appears as well. These were not the crude tools of a primitive shaman, but the refined instruments of a professional. Her costume, as described in the sagas, was a deliberate construct. The cat-skin garments linked her to Freya, the goddess who owned the chariot drawn by cats and who first taught seer to the gods. The cloak set with stones may have been heavy with amulets or talismans. Each element of her dress was a nonverbal language, signaling her identity, her affiliations with specific deities, and her inviolability. To look upon her was to understand immediately that she was other, a person who had voluntarily stepped outside the social contract of ordinary appearance to become a living symbol of the numinous. This theatricality was crucial to her efficacy. Her power was performative, and all she inspired in her audience was part of the ritual technology, lowering their psychological defenses and opening them to the reality of her visions. Ultimately, the disappearance of the völva as a formal, socially sanctioned figure marks one of the most profound cultural losses of the transition to medieval Christian Europe. With her one specific form of feminine authority, an entire corpus of experiential, ecological, and psychological knowledge, and a distinct way of interfacing with the sacred that was participatory, localized, and tied to the rhythms of the land. The Christian priest almost always male, whose authority derived from a distant bishop and a written text, offered a different kind of certainty, one of dogma and salvation, but he did not offer personalized prophecies about the success of the barley crop or the intentions of a neighbor. That form of wisdom was relegated to the realm of superstition and sin. The völva's story, therefore, is more than a historical curiosity. It is a case study in how a civilization chooses its intermediaries with the divine, and how the contours of power, both earthly and heavenly, are radically redrawn. When the nature of that intermediacy changes, her silence echoes not just in the empty high seats of saga halls, but in the very structure of how we, as inheritors of this historical trajectory, conceive of where wisdom resides and who is permitted to speak for the unseen. The international reach of the Viking Age, with its vast networks of trade, raid, and settlement, raises a compelling question. Did the völva travel? While the grapevines and saga settings are overwhelmingly Scandinavian, the ethos of her power certainly did. Norse settlers packing their belongings for the journey to Iceland, Greenland, or the shores of Britain would have carried their worldview in their minds as surely as they carried their tools and seeds. The need for her services was, if anything, amplified in this new and perilous environment.
In the uncharted landscapes of Iceland, with its volatile geology and unfamiliar spirits, the rituals of land-taking and placating local whites would have been paramount, and the völva's role as a mediator with the unknown would have been critical to a community's perceived survival. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, while compiled later, is steeped in a sense of prophetic destiny and supernatural sanction for claims, a literary atmosphere that hints at the earlier presence of such ritual specialists in the colonization process. In Greenland, the saga account of Thorbjörg is direct evidence of a practicing seeress in that harsh frontier settlement. Her prophecy there served a dire, practical purpose, diagnosing the spiritual causes of a famine and guiding the community back to favor with the unseen forces governing their fragile existence. Furthermore, the Norse presence in areas like the British Isles and Rus brought them into contact with other magical and prophetic traditions. In Ireland, they would have encountered the Fylid, the learned poet-seers who could satirize enemies with verses believed to cause physical blemishes. In the Slavic world, they met practitioners of a rich folk magic. It is not difficult to imagine a syncretism occurring at the edges of the Norse world, where a völva might incorporate new spells, new plant lore, or new concepts of spirit beings into her practice. This cross-pollination, however, would have made her even more suspect in the eyes of the consolidating Christian church back in the Scandinavian homelands, which was increasingly intent on defining a uniform, orthodox faith and rooting out eclectic, localized pagan survivals. The völva on the frontier may have been more vital to her community, but she was also becoming a more glaring anomaly in the broader, changing religious landscape of the North Atlantic world. The decline of the völva was neither uniform nor instantaneous. It occurred in fits and starts, echoing the uneven pace of Christianization itself. In remote valleys of Norway or the far-flung islands of the North Atlantic, the old ways and the old practitioners likely persisted for generations after a king had officially accepted baptism. The conversion was often a top-down political affair concerned with the allegiance of chieftains and the establishment of dioceses, not with instantly eradicating deeply ingrained folk beliefs at the homestead level. For a long time, a kind of pragmatic dual faith likely existed. A family might be baptized and attend mass, yet still secretly consult a wise woman for a healing charm or a love potion, or whisper old incantations over their livestock. The völva, in this context, didn't vanish. She shrank. She became less the grand itinerant staff-bearer arriving for a public ritual, and more the local clogcone, wise woman, or signa-kjæring, charm wife, operating in a private, diminished, and increasingly dangerous capacity. Her knowledge was fractured, her rituals simplified, her authority reduced from the cosmic to the domestic. This long twilight period is the true story of her end, a gradual dimming over centuries rather than a single extinguishing event. The paradox of the völva is that her historical erasure has only amplified her symbolic power in the modern imagination. She has become a blank canvas upon which contemporary anxieties and desires are projected. For some, she is a feminist icon, a representation of pre-patriarchal spiritual power and feminine autonomy. For others, she is a figure of ecological wisdom, intimately attuned to the natural world and its non-human intelligences. In esoteric and neo-pagan circles, attempts to reconstruct seiðr are practiced as a living spiritual path, aiming to reconnect with the consciousness of the Norse world. While these modern practices are necessarily speculative and reinterpretive, they speak to a profound hunger for the kind of direct, unmediated, and earth-connected spirituality that the völva represents. She stands as a critique of institutionalized religion, a reminder of a time when the sacred was more immanent than transcendent, and when the voice of the divine could speak through an old woman in a trance rather than from a pulpit or a page. In the final analysis, to study the feared sorceress of the Vikings is to engage in more than historical reconstruction. It is to explore the very architecture of belief and power. Her story illuminates the fragile, negotiated nature of authority in a pre-literate society, where the king's right to rule could be underpinned or undermined by a prophecy. It reveals the complex gender dynamics of a warrior culture that nonetheless reserved a supreme form of knowledge for women. It demonstrates the intimate connection between a people's metaphysics and their daily survival, and her eventual suppression charts a key transformation in Western thought, the victory of a logocentric, masculine, and universalizing religious model over an oral, feminine, and localized one. The silence that eventually enveloped the völva was the sound of a door closing on one way of being in the world. But the persistent echo of her memory, from saga page to archaeological dig to modern spiritual seeking, suggests that door was never fully locked, and that the human desire to have someone peer beyond the veil of the present, no matter how terrifying the view, remains as enduring as fate itself. The deep connection between the völva and the natural world, particularly the animal kingdom, was not merely symbolic but functional, forming a core component of her perceived power. Animals served as messengers, familiars, and conduits. Ravens and crows, as carrion birds and Odin's companions, were seen as bridges between the world of the living and the dead, their flight patterns and cries interpreted as omens. The cats whose fur lined her hood were sacred to Freyja, but they were also practical allies in spirit work. In Norse belief, cats were thought to be able to see spirits invisible to human eyes. The presence of a henbane seed in a raven's bone, as found at fiercest, is a potent archaeological whisper of this synthesis. The plant of vision housed within the bone of the prophetic bird, it suggests a ritual assemblage designed to amplify and direct spiritual sight. Furthermore, the völva's spirit journey, her fare, traveling, was often described in sagas as taking the form of an animal, a concept known as hammer, shape. She might send her consciousness forth in the form of a bear for strength, a wolf for ferocity, or a seal to traverse the ocean's depths in search of knowledge. This shape-shifting ability blurred the lines between human and beast, between the individual self and the wider, animistic world, reinforcing her status as a being who operated under a different set of natural laws. This animistic worldview extended to the very landscape she inhabited. Specific geographical features, a peculiarly shaped standing stone, a waterfall that never froze, a grove of ancient twisted trees were not just locations but portals or dwellings of wights, Vatir, land spirits who held sway over the fertility and fortune of that place. The völvas' expertise included knowing how to negotiate with these entities. A new settlement's success might depend on her performing the correct sacrifices to the local land spirit before the first foundation post was laid. Her knowledge was, in essence, a form of spiritual ecology. She understood the invisible economy of a place, which spirits required placation, which offered protection, and which were best left strictly alone. This made her indispensable in an age of expansion, where Norsemen were constantly entering into and attempting to dominate new and spiritually charged territories. Her work ensured not just physical survival, but cosmological harmony, maintaining the fragile balance between the human community and the conscious, often temperamental world it inhabited. The performance of her prophecies also followed a distinct, culturally understood syntax. They were rarely simple, declarative sentences. Instead, they were typically delivered in Jothahatra, the traditional meter of Norse wisdom poetry, characterized by its stately, rhythmic, and often cryptic qualities. This poetic form elevated her speech from mere conversation to sacred utterance. The prophecies were laden with kennings, metaphorical circumlocutions like the serpent's bed for gold, or the bone of the sea for ice. This linguistic coding served multiple purposes. It protected the knowledge from the uninitiated, it displayed her mastery of the highest form of cultural expression, and it allowed for the ambiguity and multiple interpretations that were the hallmark of true oracles. A prophecy was not a news bulletin. It was a puzzle to be unraveled over time, its true meaning often becoming clear only in hindsight after the events had transpired. This created a powerful feedback loop of belief. When the obscure prediction eventually matched a known outcome, it confirmed her infallibility and deepened the mystery surrounding her original words. The form was as important as the content, weaving her pronouncements into the very fabric of Norse poetic and intellectual tradition. Despite her power, the völva was ultimately a tragic figure, embodying a profound loneliness inherent in her role. She was, by necessity, set apart. Her travels meant she likely had no permanent home or fixed kin group in a society where identity was deeply rooted in family and land. Her celibacy, implied by many saga descriptions of elderly, unmarried women, would have been an extreme anomaly in a culture that valued large families and dynastic legacy. She lived with one foot in the human world and the other in a realm of spirits and visions that ordinary people could only fear. The physical toll of her rituals, possibly involving toxic entheogens, would have been severe. The psychological burden of carrying the secrets, hopes, and doomed futures of countless individuals is incalculable. She was a mirror for her society's deepest fears and aspirations, but a mirror that could never truly belong to the world it reflected. Her authority was absolute yet isolating, her wisdom vast yet alienating. In the end, the völva's path was a solitary one, walking the misty boundaries between worlds, a translator of fate's cruel and beautiful language, destined to be remembered more in trembling whispers than in the clear light of common day. Thus, the figure of the feared sorceress recedes into the mists of history not as a defeated witch, but as the representative of a complete and coherent world system that could not survive the tectonic shifts of ideology, politics, and faith that forged medieval Europe. Her disappearance marks the endpoint of a way of seeing, where every hill had a name and a spirit, where destiny was a fabric to be read, and where the most powerful voice in the land might belong to a woman who had traded her ordinary life for the terrible gift of sight. The legacy she leaves is not one of spells or specific prophecies, but a haunting question about the price of knowledge and the shapes of power, a question that, like the echo of her staff striking the hall floor, continues to resonate long after the sound itself has faded into silence. The völva's relationship with time itself was fundamentally different from the linear, progressive view that would come to dominate the Christian and modern eras. In the Norse cyclical conception, where history moved towards Ragnarok only to begin anew, her visions were not merely glimpses of a fixed future, but perceptions of patterns repeating across the great turning of the ages. When she spoke, she might be seeing layers of time simultaneously, the past deeds of an ancestor manifesting as a curse in the present, or recurrent conflict echoing a mythic battle from the dawn of the world. This non-linear temporal awareness gave her pronouncements a depth and weight that felt anchored in the very bedrock of reality, far removed from mere guesswork. Her prophecies connected the individual to the archetypal, a farmer's dispute over a boundary stone to the primal struggle between order and chaos. This cosmological context is what made her insight so devastatingly authoritative. She wasn't predicting events, she was revealing the underlying, eternal patterns as they were about to manifest in the fleeting moment. Her trance was a journey not just through space, but through the layers of time itself, a faculty that made her the ultimate historian and futurist combined. This perception of time also influenced the very structure of her knowledge transmission. Seiðr and its associated lore were an oral tradition, passed from master to apprentice, likely through generations of women within certain families or spiritual lineages. This mode of transmission was fluid, adaptive, and deeply personal, rooted in experience and altered states of consciousness rather than fixed texts. It was knowledge that lived in the body, in the memory of ritual gestures, in the taste of specific herbs, and in the sound of the Vardloka songs. The Christianization process, with its emphasis on scripture, Latin liturgy, and written canon, represented a direct assault on this embodied oral epistemology. The völvas' wisdom could not be codified, debated in a monastery, or approved by a bishop. It existed only in performance and memory. When her lineage was broken by conversion, persecution, or simply the death of an apprentice without a successor, that unique constellation of knowledge vanished forever. It was not a philosophy that could be rediscovered in a manuscript, it was a lived practice that died with its practitioners. This is why the archaeological finds are so poignant. They are the silent, physical echoes of a sophisticated, intellectual and spiritual system that left no written manual of its own, only its tools and the distorted reflections in later texts. The geographical distribution of völva graves and saga references also hints at interesting socio-political nuances. They appear prominently in the Icelandic sagas, set in a society that consciously styled itself as a republic of free farmers, deliberately rejecting the consolidating monarchy of Harald Fairhair in Norway. In this context, the völva's power may have represented an alternative, decentralized source of authority that was more compatible with the Icelandic Commonwealth's political ethos. Her independence mirrored the independence of the Goði, chieftain, and her spiritual authority could check secular power in a system with no king. In mainland Scandinavia, as kingdoms solidified, her kind of wild, unattached power may have been seen as increasingly threatening to royal consolidation. A king like Harald Bluetooth, erecting the Great Gelling Stone to proclaim Denmark's conversion to Christianity, was not just adopting a new god, he was centralizing religious authority under his own crown, making himself the intermediary between his people and the divine. In this new model, the freelance völva was an anarchic element, a competitor to royal and episcopal control. Her suppression was, therefore, not merely religious but a key step in the state-building process, the monopolization of the sacred by the emerging nation-state. Yet, even in her diminished folkloric form, the archetype of the seeress exerted a subtle influence on the very literature that sought to bury her. The Icelandic sagas, those masterpieces of understated realism, are nevertheless haunted by prophecy. From the moment Njál foresees the burning of his house to the curses that echo through Gisla saga, the sense of inescapable fate is the engine of the narrative. This literary fatalism is a direct inheritance from the worldview the völva embodied. The saga characters move with a grim dignity toward ends they often sense but cannot avoid, much like clients living under the shadow of a völva's pronouncement. Furthermore, the strong, often prophetically gifted women who populate the saga's figures, like Hallgerða in Njál's saga or Gudrun in Laxdæla saga, can be seen as secularized, literary echoes of the seers. They possess a fierce intuition, a will that shapes events, and a chilling clarity about the tragic trajectories of their lives and families. They wield words as weapons, much as the völva did, though their arena is social conflict rather than spiritual revelation. In this way, the völva's essence was sublimated into the emerging national literature. Her power translated from the magical to the psychological, but her function as a revealer of uncomfortable truths and a driver of destiny remained intact. Thus, the journey from the feared sorceress of the Viking hall to the clog cone of the rural periphery and finally to the archetype in saga and modern memory is a map of a profound cultural transformation. It charts the movement from an immanent to a transcendent sacred, from oral to literate authority, from decentralized to centralized power, and from a magical to a psychological understanding of human motivation. The völva stands at the crossroads of all these transitions. Her silence is the space where these changes converged and solidified. To listen to that silence, however, is to hear not just an absence, but the shape of what was lost, a way of knowing that was holistic, ecstatic, and intimately tied to the whisper of the land and the weave of time. Her story is ultimately a reminder that history is written not only by kings and armies, but by the slow, seismic shifts in how a people dream, how they fear, and whom they trust to guide them through the dark. The völva's intimate connection to death and the afterlife provided another profound source of her authority and the dread that surrounded her. Her trance states were understood not as mere hallucinations, but as literal journeys to other realms, to hell, the damp, quiet underworld, or to the dwellings of the gods. In these journeys, she could commune with the dead, extracting information from ancestors or recent casualties. This ability made her a unique bridge between the living community and its past, a conduit for grievances, wisdom, or warnings from beyond the grave. A property dispute might be settled by her consulting the founding settler's spirit. A mysterious illness might be diagnosed as the work of a restless, unavenged ghost. Her role in funerary rites, particularly for the high-status individuals whose passage needed careful supernatural management to ensure they did not become malign forces, was likely significant. The staffs found in graves may have been interred not just as status symbols, but as functional tools for the deceased's own journey or as seals to contain their power. By trafficking with the dead, the völva engaged in the most dangerous commerce of all, handling a spiritual contagion that both terrified and fascinated her contemporaries. This aspect of her work solidified her image as one who walked boundaries, whose feet were planted in the world of the living, but whose mind consorted with shadows, making her a figure of indispensable but chilling utility. The economic dimensions of her practice further reveal her embeddedness in Viking Age society. Her services were not offered for free. The sagas mention rich payments, meals, lodging, and often substantial gifts of clothing, jewelry, or silver. The fur cat grave, with its fine goods and exotic items, is testament to a successful career. She was, in effect, a highly specialized freelance professional, part of the broader gift exchange economy that bound Norse society together. Her fee was both payment and a symbolic exchange, sealing a contract between the client and the supernatural forces she would engage on their behalf. This economic reality underscores that her power was not just mystical but social. She generated wealth and commanded resources through her exclusive skill set. It also created dependencies. A chieftain who relied on her prophecies for military or political decisions became bound to her not just by belief, but by a cycle of gift and obligation. Her economic independence, derived from a source outside farming, raiding, or trade, was yet another facet of her autonomy, setting her apart in a society where wealth was typically tied to land, lineage, or the sword. When considering the völva's eventual fate, it is crucial to distinguish between her disappearance as a formal institution and the persistence of the human archetype she represented. The socially sanctioned, itinerant staff-bearer, operating with public consent and fear, was indeed eradicated by the combined forces of church and crown. However, the fundamental human capacities she embodied, heightened intuition, sensitivity to pattern and omen, knowledge of herbal psychotropics, and the performance of healing or harming through ritual did not vanish. These traits were persecuted, fragmented, and driven into the realm of illicit witchcraft, but they survived. The thousands of women executed in the Nordic witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries were, in a tragic historical irony, the distorted descendants of the völva. Their accusations of storm-raising, animal harming, and maleficium directly mirror the powers attributed to their pagan predecessors. However, the context had inverted. Where the völva was once a central, if feared, pillar of her community, the early modern witch was defined as its antisocial enemy, a servant of the devil in a cosmic war. This transformation marks the complete ideological victory of the new order, successfully recasting a complex spiritual authority into a purely diabolical one. In the 21st century, the völva's resurgence in popular culture and spirituality speaks to contemporary discontents. In an age of ecological crisis, her deep connection to a living, conscious, natural world resonates. In an era skeptical of monolithic institutions, her model of decentralized, personal, experiential spirituality is appealing. For those seeking to reclaim pre-Christian European heritage, she offers a powerful, feminine-identified figure around which to build practice. Modern reconstructions of seiðr, while necessarily imaginative, attempt to reanimate the core techniques of trance, prophecy, and spirit work, treating the old sources as a blueprint for a living relationship with the unseen. This neo-pagan revival, however, exists in a world utterly different from the one that produced the original völva. It is a conscious choice, not an unquestioned cultural framework. It operates without the pervasive societal belief that gave her pronouncements their world-altering weight. The modern völva is therefore a reinterpretation, a symbol of resistance to modernity's disenchantment rather than a direct continuation. Yet, the very act of reaching back for her figure confirms her enduring potency as an emblem of alternative knowledge and power. Therefore, the final word on the feared sorceress is not an epitaph, but an acknowledgement of a lasting echo. Her historical existence reveals the stunning complexity of the Viking mind, a culture capable of producing both the ruthless raider and the ecstatic mystic, and of understanding that both were necessary for navigating a world thick with visible and invisible threats. Her story forces us to expand our definition of power in the medieval North, beyond longships and fortified halls, to include the quiet, terrifying authority of the woman on the high seat, her eyes rolled back, speaking in the measured cadence of fate. In silencing her, the medieval church and state may have believed they were excising a pagan superstition. In reality, they were closing down a whole channel of human experience, a way of knowing that was relational, embodied, and conversant with the dark. We are left with the artifacts, the iron staff, the henbane seeds, the cryptic stanzas of the Völuspa, and we are left with the questions she embodies, questions about who gets to speak for the unknown, and what we lose when we decide that only one kind of voice is permitted to answer. The völva's legacy intersects powerfully with the evolving understanding of gender in the early medieval North. Her existence complicates the stereotypical image of Norse society as a straightforward patriarchy of warriors and housewives. While men held overt political and martial dominance, the völva occupied a third, transcendent space. She wielded a form of social power that was not derivative of male kin but inherent to her office, a phenomenon anthropologists sometimes term ritual gender, a status that supersedes ordinary male-female categories. This did not constitute equality, but rather a unique, potent exception that proved the rule. Her ability to prophesy, curse, and bless placed her in a position to critique and influence the very men who otherwise dominated society. A king's legitimacy could be questioned by her words. A warrior's luck in battle could be perceived as dependent on her favor. This created a subtle but significant check on purely martial authority, embedding a form of spiritual accountability into the fabric of power. Her presence signifies that in the Norse worldview, ultimate authority, the authority of fate itself, was understood to be beyond gender, and its human interpreters could therefore exist outside the conventional gendered hierarchy. The process of her marginalization is thus also a story of the narrowing of possibilities for female authority. As Christianity established its monopoly on the sacred, the formal religious roles it offered women as nuns, anchoresses, or abbesses were contained within the church's institutional walls and its patriarchal structure. The wild, freelance, cosmological authority of the völva had no equivalent in the new dispensation. The female mystic within Christianity, such as a Hildegard of Bingen, operated by securing the approval of male clerics and framing her visions within orthodox theology. The völva answered to no human institution, only to the spirits and her own tradition. Her eradication, therefore, closed off a path of autonomous female spiritual leadership that was deeply rooted in the pre-Christian past, funneling religious expression for women into more controlled, submissive channels. The witch hunts that followed centuries later were the violent, logical conclusion of this process, criminalizing the last vestiges of independent female knowledge that had once been the völva's honored craft. Examining the völva also reframes our understanding of Viking Age, science and medicine. Her practice was a precursor to these fields, a holistic system of inquiry that did not separate the physical from the spiritual. When she diagnosed an illness, she sought its spiritual etiology, a curse, a offended wight, while also likely employing a vast empirical knowledge of herbs, poultices, and bone setting. The psychoactive plants in her toolkit were not just for visions. Substances like henbane and mandrake had known, if dangerous, analgesic and sedative properties. Her trance states might have been used to diagnose psychological ailments or communal tensions invisible to the ordinary eye. In a world without germ theory or clinical psychology, her framework provided explanations and interventions that were coherent within the cultural reality. Her disappearance meant not just the loss of magic, but the fragmentation of this holistic approach. The church would later assign the physical to emerging secular medicine, though still limited, and the spiritual to confession and prayer, severing the connection the völva embodied between the health of the body, the mind, and the community's spiritual ecosystem. Ultimately, the enduring fascination with the völva stems from her embodiment of a profound mystery, the source of true knowledge. In our modern world, knowledge is democratized, digitized, and secularized. We look to experts, data, and peer-reviewed studies. The Viking Age offered different pathways: the knowledge of experience, the sailor, the blacksmith, the knowledge of tradition, the law speaker, the poet, and the knowledge of revelation, the völva's domain. Her revelations came from a source beyond the human, accessed through extreme states of consciousness. This gave her words an unassailable, oracular quality that data and tradition could not match. She represented the terrifying idea that the most important truths are not earned through labor or study, but granted through sacrifice and ordeal, and delivered through a fragile human vessel. This touches a deep, archaic nerve. In an age of information overload, her figure paradoxically represents a purer, more terrible form of knowing, not aggregated facts, but revealed truth. The final image of the völva is not one of a witch burning, but of a figure fading into the landscape from which she came. One can imagine her, an old woman wrapped in a dark cloak, stopping at a crossroads on her travels, looking back toward the halls where she was once feasted and feared, and then turning to walk into the encroaching forest of a changing world. The paths she walked between the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen, the past and the future grew over, the high seats were dismantled, but the questions she posed remained. How do we live with uncertainty? Who has the right to interpret the will of the invisible? What is the price of looking ahead? The Norse answer, for a time, was to place those questions in the hands of a terrifying, respected, and lonely woman with a staff. Her story is a reminder that every civilization makes its own arrangements with the unknown, and the shape of those arrangements tells us more about its character than any battle it ever won or any treasure it ever buried. The silence that followed her passing was the sound of a world becoming, in some fundamental way, less enchanted, less dangerous, and perhaps less wise.